All right, welcome to the second lecture of this first introduction to metaphysics. And today we're going to be talking about reality a little bit and a couple of classical metaphysical puzzles. And then, yeah, well, next week we're going to be moving on to discussion of free will. All right, so here we go. When we're talking about metaphysics, there's a couple of really big questions that come up. When we're talking about metaphysics, we ask, what the nature of things is. And one really, kind of basic and interesting question that puzzles philosophers and is asked by metaphysicians is, what the heck is everything, right? Like, what is everything? Is there one big unified thing that, there are parts of? Is there just this like massive single universe? Or is there lots of little things and then, they're just sort of spread out in the space void or something like that? And then there's, the further question that's sort of related to what is everything that is like, well, okay, what's the stuff that everything is made of? Like, if everything is made of stuff, what is that stuff, and why is that the stuff of the universe? Um, Now, this relates to what's commonly called the metaphysics of science, and the metaphysics of science is kind of an attempt to codify the kinds of entities that science deals with, the kinds of properties and objects and individuals, and then in that discuss the relations between different kinds of things. Like how is it that big things are made up of small things? What's the relationship between big things and small things? A planet is made up of uh, dirt and chemical, or chemicals, chemical reactions. There's some gravity there, right? um, how is it that the small stuff makes up the big stuff? Similarly, how is it that things happen along a time period, right? How is it that things from one period can affect things in another period? How is it that things that happened so long ago can come to constitute things that are happening now, or help influence things that happen now? Now, sort of in a background, in kind of historical context of like metaphysical theories, attempts at kind of giving us almost scientific codification of the stuff that makes up the world. The ancient Greek philosophers were kind of the first to really start thinking about these issues, and they tried to answer a fundamental question. Basically, they asked, what is the arche? And the arche, that's a technical term that they were using, but basically the way it's translated is as principle or fundamental stuff. So when you ask what is the arche, it's basically you're asking, well, what's the fundamental principle of the universe? What's the fundamental stuff that holds everything together, that keeps everything going? Like, what is that? Like, how does it work? And there were a few ancients that gave different answers and kind of argued about this stuff. Probably the most famous among them is Thales. Thales was one of the sort of earliest known Greek philosophers, and he thought that the first principle of all things, the arche, was water. Basically, that everything that existed was in somehow or in some way composed of or related to water. And now, water, that sounds a little bit ridiculous, but in a sense, what he meant by water was, they didn't really know what water was back in the ancient Greek times, but he saw water as this sort of fluid motion substance. It's the kind of thing that's constantly changing. And so he thought of the universe as basically composed of this fluid substance that would constantly change. And that's why the universe, was always in motion, in a sense, or something like that. People were composed of water because that was like, the thing that gave them life, that gave them spirit in some way. Now, so that was like, that's like the first metaphysical theory of reality, of like what stuff is made of, put forward by Thales that we know of. Now, Thales had some students, and his students tended to disagree with him, as do students generally. And so from Thales, we get Anaximander, another ancient Greek, who disagreed with Thales. And the reason he disagreed with Thales was, well, basically back in the day, way back when, there were four generally recognized kinds of element in a way. There was water and fire and air and earth. And Anaximander thought, no, look, like of those four things, it's not possible for the most fundamental one to be water. Because the water is, in a sense, according to him, the opposite of fire, right? It's wet, it's not hot, and you can't get in any way fire out of water, right? Anaximander basically couldn't imagine a way that fire could somehow come from water or be composed of water. So he thought in the end, actually, there was no basic element. There couldn't, the arche, whatever it was, the fundamental principle of the universe, the fundamental stuff of the universe, couldn't possibly be one of the basic elements, because he thought that if it was one of the basic elements, then the fundamental problem would obviously be the other one, right? If fire was the basic element, you would have a world without water. If earth was the basic element, you can't really get air out of earth, and you can't get earth out of air, right? So for each of these, he thought, it can't be that the thing comes from its opposite. So instead, what he appeals to is called the apeiron, which is a kind of neutral substance he thought of as the indefinite and eternal substance of the chaotic void. So Anaximander basically postulates this theory that there's some more primitive, basic stuff of the universe that is what all of the basic elements are made of, and that stuff is what constitutes everything in the universe. Now, Anaximenes, a student of, I think, Anaximander, returned back to the elements and thought, no, there's a problem with the apeiron, because it's just so indefinite. Like, if it's an indefinite kind of thing, like who's to say that it actually makes anything up? We don't know what it is. So Anaximenes said, wait, no, I think that maybe we could actually postulate that air is the most primitive arche, the fundamental principle of the universe that holds everything together. And why? Well, he thought because air in different forms, that is like, thin air and thick air, can get you pretty much everything. He thought that, so basically air, when rarefied or heated, you'd get something like fire. So he thought of fire as kind of like the minimum amount of air, right? If you have very little air, you end up with fire. He thought when you condense air, like, push it around, you get wind. He thought when you thicken air, you can get, when you condense wet air, obviously, you get water droplets, and that's, maybe that's part of why he thought that, that air could somehow create water. And then air, when thickened, if you were actually to somehow, I mean, in a way, it's right? If you condense the air and were able to remove all the carbon dioxide, you would end up with a physical substance, Earth, right? You would end up with carbon molecules. So that's an interesting kind of point in Anaximenes. He's wrong, but he's on the right track in some way. And then after Anaximenes, we've also got this ancient Greek named Democritus. Democritus is famous in a way for preempting the atomic theory of everything. He kind of stopped caring about like exactly what it was that everything was made up of, like what kind of stuff it is. And he instead went for, look, whatever it's made up of, it's too small for us to see. So it's really too small for us to actually get a handle on what it is. But he thought these things are clearly made up of parts, right? Like regular stuff is made up of parts, and there's smaller and smaller parts that we can cut things down into until they're too small to see. So it must be that there's parts at the bottom of all of this stuff. Like, because you can break things up, it seems like that, whatever the stuff is, it's not gunky, it's not fluid. It's like actually can, there's hard edges to things. And so he thought, well, okay, maybe there's at the very bottom of everything, there are these atoms, these, undividable little bits. And they are, it's the atoms in the void. And that's what everything is made up of. There's like these little tiny fundamental uncuttable atoms, and those things compose everything, and they basically are just floating around in the void. And so the basic stuff of the universe is really whatever it's made of. It comes in an atomic structure. Beyond Democritus, we get sort of the theories of Socrates and Plato. So I think what's sort of interesting is Democritus is almost getting us near what we would modern day call like a form of physicalism. If everything is just made up of atoms in the void. But Socrates and Plato kind of go beyond that and bring out a more dualistic perspective about the nature of the universe. They say, okay, sure, Democritus, maybe stuff is made of atoms, little bits. Maybe everything is, composed of these things. But that's just the material stuff, right? That's just the matter of the world. The matter of the world is atoms. But that doesn't explain, like, if there's stuff out there, that doesn't explain how any of this stuff comes to be shaped into the ways that it is, right? There's matter, but there's also stuff that's made of matter. And these things aren't just matter. I mean, like, there's a big difference between having a clump of matter, like a rock or a piece of dirt or a pile of sand, and having, a house, a chair, a human person, a kitty cat, right? There must be some kind of form, something to explain how the material, which comes in discrete bits, it can be packaged up into these larger functional complexes. And so Socrates and Plato ended up kind of postulating that there must be some other kind of realm in which these forms have their being, and that in the real world we've got this kind of combination of matter and form that are kind of smooshed together. So at least according to the Platonic theory, there is this ideal place where the forms exist in their pure form, and in the world where they're sullied by the matter of real things, they don't actually show up in their truest of selves, which is, there's a lot of metaphor that I don't really know what's going on. And that's kind of what Aristotle did, right? So Aristotle comes, he's a student of Plato, and he's like, I don't know what you guys are talking about. Like this idea of the forms is great. Like there are clearly things. There's form to the world. There are things that come in structure. It's not just hunks of matter floating around. It's not just collections of little particles. Sure, there's forms, but I don't know what you're talking about when you're talking about this other place where the forms exist. So Aristotle ended up coming up with this theory that, look, yeah, there are these things. There's matter out there, and there's form, and things that like human beings and tables and chairs and mountains and planets, they are made of matter, but they have a form, and that's kind of how the theory for him goes. But the form is not somehow located somewhere other than in some other realm. It's exactly right where the object is, right? So the form of me is right where I am, right? I'm made of matter, but I have a form. The form of the mountain is right where the mountain is, right? It's, there's, and the idea there, at least for Aristotle, it's somewhat confusing, is that these forms are split up. They're all over the place, right? So each person, the form of being a human being is located where each of us persons are, right? There's the form of being me, and I'm a person, and so the form of being a person is with me and in me and sort of where I am, and the form of being a person is in you or with you or where you are as well. And so there's these, these two aspects to every individual thing that's not simply an atom. um, it's a thing that is made of material but has this formal aspect. um, the Sorry for the little break. um, on top of discussing form and matter, Aristotle also was a little bit of a physicist, and thought that he kind of thought that the universe was this eternally existing entity, but he also saw that the universe was moving and that everything was moving. And Aristotle then made an argument basically to the effect that if the universe is moving, there has to be some initial thing that started it moving, that caused it to initially move. And so, he had this kind of postulation that, something like God or some kind of first mover must have set the universe in motion. Otherwise, everything would have sort of just been standing still at all times and for eternity. Um, After Aristotle, we get the rise of Christianity, and Western religion in general, and Christianity sort of blows a lot of this sort of early philosophy out of the water, at least insofar as it becomes very widespread. And Christianity takes Aristotle seriously and says, look, the first mover is God. The first mover is God. God's eternal. He's all powerful. He's all good. And he's got this realm called heaven. And beyond that, beyond the matter and form of the world, there is also this third realm, the spiritual realm. The spiritual realm that, so you are made of matter. You have a form as a human being, but then you also have this spirit or this soul or something like that. And then, since probably the beginning of the modern era, I mean, since the beginning of, after Christ, or the we get a kind of clash between, at least especially, yeah, in the last few hundred years, between what we might think of as religious perspectives, that claim that the universe itself is of supernatural origin, or that there are multiple kinds of things. There's the material of the world, but then there's also the spirit world. And then materialist scientists, or people that are of a certain naturalistic materialist bent, that think like, look, I don't really understand what these things are, what these the forms of things are. That seems sort of spooky. Similarly, like with the spiritual realm, like where do we have any evidence for stuff like that? And so, in a more, so turning from this sort of history to the contemporary scene, we end up with what we might think of as the dominant view today amongst academics and scientists, philosophers alike. These two views, often called naturalism and physicalism. Naturalism is a broader category of theory. Physicalism takes a specific view on the nature of objects. So naturalism says something like everything that exists, everything that's out there is in some way the result of a natural process. Whatever it turns out that those natural processes are, everything's a form of natural process. And so it sort of denies a kind of supernaturalism about the world. Physicalism, on the other hand, says, look, all that actually exists, whatever the stuff that there is, it's physical. Down to the fundamental particles, we got fundamental physical particles, and then those things compose and make up everything that's larger than that. And so insofar as those things are physical, everything bigger than that that they make up is physical as well. And nothing else besides the physical exists. Now, so of course there are other contenders for kind of these big answers, these big questions, answers to these big questions in philosophy, right? There's so the big question like what is everything and what makes it all up? Well, we still got things that we've talked about previously, like idealism, which is the idea that everything that there is actually just kind of an idea in some way, or a perception, or an idea in the mind of God, or something that's been generated by God into our minds. And that view is people have held it. I don't find it terribly plausible these days. But something maybe more plausible for a lot of people is this kind of supernaturalist approach, where the idea is that, look, there's clearly this natural stuff that's here, but everything that's natural has to come from somewhere, and everything that's natural, seems to have some kind of origin. Things did have to get started. The Big Bang had to happen, or something like that. And so, in the end, all that is natural has to come from something that is non-natural or supernatural, above the natural. And even maybe the thought that there are still like supernatural forces at work in the world that cause us to exist and live, or something like that. So in the end, we get this sort of dualism versus monism. Dualism now, at least sort of in the classic sense, modern sense, is the idea that there's something beyond merely the natural. Or maybe the other thing is similarly natural in a sense, but it's something other than the physical. It's something that is spiritual or mental. And dualists tend to believe in, we have the natural realm, or the physical realm, and then the realm where our souls or our minds exist in some way. So we get these questions of like how many substances there are, how many kinds of thing there are. A substance is another way of saying like a kind of thing, like a fundamental kind of thing. There's an obvious example is something like, well, when it comes to certain types of substance at the chemical level, we've got solids, we've got liquids, and we've got air, and then I think we also have plasma or something like that. But think about this like even more fundamentally, right? With respect to those kinds of substances, each of those is a kind of physical substance. But when we get down to talking about the most basic sorts of things that there are, sometimes people think, oh no, there's just one kind of stuff that's out there. There's just the physical. And the dualists tend to say, no, there's two different kinds of substances, at least two different kinds. Some will go beyond that and say that there's a form of like spiritual substance, but the dualism generally thinks of there being like, material physical stuff out there, but then also mental stuff, or something along the lines of the stuff that souls are made of. Now, physicalism has basically been on the rise for the last, say, 200 years as a theory, right? So remember, it's a form of naturalism. It says that everything is the result of a natural process. And physicalism takes a more serious and in a way more difficult to defend approach by saying that everything that exists is in some way or other physical. And why is physicalism attractive to people, or why is it so popular these days? And I think the biggest answer is that it's successful. There's been a lot of success in science, and particularly physics, in explaining how causal things work, right? How causation works, where we explain how larger causal systems function on the basis of explaining how smaller causal systems function, where the larger physical objects are composed of, in some way, the smaller physical objects. So in a way, in physics, we've learned how to reduce some physical kinds to others. That is, we've learned how to take larger things like molecules and explain how those molecules work by talking about their parts, by talking about how atoms work, right? So in physics, we've got this sort of explanation. We've basically the foundation of chemistry is physics, and so because we've been able and to so successfully give this kind of explanation, people have thought, oh well, in the end, then probably everything is going to be able to be explained in some way, shape, or form at bottom in physical terms, in terms that appeal to the fundamentals of physics. So people have thought, chemistry is going to eventually get reduced to physics because we'll be able to say how chemical substances work on the basis of how the physical particles of the chemical substances operate with respect to one another. Biology maybe will also be reducible to physics. Biology we have to reduce to chemistry at a certain level, but we can reduce chemistry to physics. If we can figure out how to reduce biology to chemistry, we'll be able to explain physicalism. So these are kinds of basically physicalist reductionist theories that say explanation is ultimately going to reduce all things to the physical. And so when we're talking about, chemical molecules, we can talk about them in physical terms. When we're talking about biological creatures or living organisms, we can sort of do away with these things in one sense and talk about just how the physical stuff that they're made of interacts. This kind of as sort of biology grew up as a modern science, there was a theory called vitalism that was around for a long time. And vitalism thought, look, there's physical stuff, but then there's got to be this sort of essence of life that's not physical. The essence of life is the thing that causes you to be alive and to live, like to do things, to act and think and have your being. But slowly that theory has faded into the background as we've been able to explain how it is that bodies work, on the basis of biochemical explanation, right? So life itself, it seems, has come to be explained in purely physical terms. And because of that, physicalism has, been in one way or another dominant over the last few hundred years. There are a couple of domains left, though, for the dualist. And it's very difficult, I think, for physicalists to actually explain these few other things away. So one of them is psychology. If biology can be reduced to physics, then the next thing that maybe could be reduced to physics would be psychology, because it's something that we can probably reduce to a form of biology. But that seems really difficult right now. Like, it's very unclear how psychological explanation is going to ever be reducible to a form of biological explanation. Similarly, the nature of consciousness itself. People have no idea how consciousness could come about on the basis of physical stuff alone. It's not like we see it every day, right? We have no idea how banging a bunch of atoms together gets you from, just some physical stuff to all of a sudden a conscious and aware being or creature that can think and represent how the world is, perceive how the world is. And finally, qualia, which is in a sense an aspect of consciousness. Qualia is like the qualitative features of consciousness, right? I mean, like what it's like to see the color red or to taste an apple, but that doesn't seem like a physical characteristic of the world. It's a special character. It's a special property of your conscious experience. And so these issues are still sort of left for physicalism to try and explain, but they're physicalists think that they are explicable in physical terms, and detractors from physicalism, like dualists, think no, these things are always going to be inexplicable from the physicalist perspective. All right, so why be anything like a physicalist? Well, physicalism is pretty solid insofar as we've gotten really good at giving physical explanations. Physical explanations are mostly bottom up. That is, when it comes to explaining some larger phenomena, when we're physicalists, we're trying to explain them in terms of the smaller phenomena. So, for example, take water tension. We explain the causal macro properties of water, like how things float or that they float, by appealing to the properties of the water particles, the smaller things, right? So basically, what do? We talk, if we're going to talk about water tension, we're going to talk about how ultimately the density of the underlying water molecules, taken together, how compact they are, versus the density of the thing that's sitting on top of those water molecules. The things that are less dense tend to float. The things that are more dense tend to sink. And so in this case, more often than not, how the water molecules are sitting together can hold something that is less dense up at the top of the water. Now, if we're looking, in a sense, for what exists fundamentally in the world, and it seems like we don't really need to postulate things at these higher levels if we have the ability to explain the causal properties of those things in terms of the causal properties of the fundamental stuff that makes them up, right? So the idea here is like, look, we don't need to think of a glass of water as a particular fundamentally existent entity, because we can think of it as this complex system that is composed of lots of molecules of water. And we can explain all of the properties of the glass of water, like namely that, a paperclip can float in a glass of water. We can explain all those properties, like the way that it looks, the things that it does, in terms of the fundamental relationships between the fundamental particles, all the things that the glass of water is made up of. So we can just sort of say what the physically fundamental things are, and then we can explain away all those higher level things in terms of the fundamental things and the relationships to one another. Now, so the thought here then is something like we just don't need to think when it comes to physics, when it comes to ontology, when it comes to metaphysics, we don't need to think of these larger things as existing in any serious way if we're looking for what fundamentally exists. So you might then move to this kind of puzzle, and I think it's a good puzzle. Like, so do chairs even exist then if we can explain them away by appealing to the properties of the fundamental stuff that kind of makes them up? So now, if you think that in order for something to exist, it has to be in some sense fundamental, it has to be a fundamental thing, and you think that chairs clearly aren't fundamental because they're made up of stuff. They're made up of more stuff. And so chairs really don't exist. What there is there's the fundamental stuff, and that stuff makes up the chair. And then a chair is just a cluster of things, right? It's not really a real fundamentally existent thing. It exists only because it's made up of more fundamental stuff that really exists. Well, you might think like, yeah, or look, chairs don't have any causal powers of their own. Chairs don't do anything in the world beyond what it is that particles arranged in a particular shape do, right? Particles arranged in a particular shape can function in a way that a chair functions. And so really the chair isn't anything over and above all of the physical particles. Then in a sense, yeah, like if you buy into this whole way of thinking about things, then yeah, it's true. Chairs don't really exist. The only things that exist are the fundamental physical particles. But there's an interesting question here as to why we should buy into this whole way of thinking, this reductionist, physicalist way of thinking. And that's what sort of our first little puzzle here is going to be about. So why should we think that there aren't really chairs, and that science actually tells us there just aren't these things? They don't really exist. What really exists is the fundamental stuff that when put in the right shape, you get a chair. but really that chair is just made up of all this fundamental stuff, and so the chair doesn't exist in any serious over the top, like over and above the fundamental stuff way. And one reason for thinking that is, well, because science has been so successful up to this point. And so if science is continuing to be successful and it's telling us that chairs don't exist, then we have a good reason for believing that chairs don't exist. But is it really the success of science that's a good reason for thinking that chairs don't exist? I mean, it seems so obvious that chairs exist, right? So you might think like, okay, what even is a chair? Is a chair really just a collection of particles? Like what kind of particles? Like, it seems like all different kinds of particles can make up a chair. You can have wood particles that make up wood, you have particles that make up metal, you can have like you could make a chair out of ice. So maybe, I mean, it's funny, I think, to think about a chair as not really being like a real thing if all these different kinds of things could make up chairs. It's not entirely clear um, that chairs are, in a sense, any kind of natural kind of thing, right? They're a sort of man-made thing. They're a thing that people imbue with a purpose, right? You could cut down a tree and use the stump as a chair. So similarly, if you don't think chairs exist, I mean, like, I'm pretty sure I exist. We figured that one out with the cogito and Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. So I'm pretty sure I exist. And I'm pretty sure I can sit down in chairs, right? And if it's possible for me to sit down in a chair, then um, how come chairs don't exist? I don't think I'm sitting down on a pile of atoms. I'm sitting down in a chair, right? So isn't the property or ability for a chair to hold me up a real property of the thing? I mean, atoms are mostly empty space. Collections of atoms are mostly empty space, and it seems like I can be held up by a chair where I don't think I'd be able to be held up by some collection of atoms. So can we really explain, and this is what I'm getting at, these high level properties of things, like the hardness of a chair, the hardness of a piece of wood, the ability for something to hold me up, to let me sit at a table, right? Can we explain the high level properties by appealing to the clusters of particles that are in complex relations to one another at the lower level of explanation, at the physical level? And in a sense, how you answer this question will determine whether or not you think that chairs exist. So there's a few problems for what we might think of as reductive physicalism. Reductive physicalism being the view that says in the end that none of these macro level objects actually exist. All the things that exist are these fundamental objects that stand in specific physical relations to one another. Certain problems, well, one of them is top-down causation, right? At the very least, it seems like it's possible for larger things to cause smaller things, right? Isn't it possible, don't you think? Like, even if you, as a human being, are a purely physical system, physical being, physical object, isn't it possible for you, as a physical object, to cause something? That is like, imagine you push a button and it causes an explosion. Well, isn't that some sort of larger biological entity causing a physical reaction, not just a cluster of atoms causing an explosion? Um, I mean, and similarly, like, Matt, think about your car. Your car is composed of lots of little particles, but because your car moves from one place to another, that determines how a particle that's in your left back tire moves through the world. It's not that the particles themselves kind of all just shifting around from one place to the other. No, it's the particles that are in this composition relation. They're composing the car, but then it's the car itself, the whole car, that's moving the particle from one place to another. So it's an interesting question whether or not large complex causal systems can in some way be the reason or the cause of a part of the system to come to be in a particular state that it could be, right? So in one way, it seems like it's unclear whether or not causation or explanations about physical causes have to always be in terms of, the bigger thing is explained by the smaller thing. Um, yeah, so that's seems like a kind of problem for reductive forms of physicalism. Um, Similarly, here's another big problem for a reductive form of physicalism. Middle-sized dry goods, middle-sized objects that we normally interact with, they're not really just groups of particles, right? So take the chair again. Think about this. Think about the chair. Break the leg off of the chair that you've got and replace it with a new one, right? So you went to IKEA, you bought a spare leg for the chair that you've got. You break one leg off, you replace it with the new one. Now, question: do you still have the same chair? Well, it seems like you do, right? It's not like it's a brand new chair. You've got the same old chair. It's just got a new leg on it. So if you have the same old chair and you got a new leg, well, do you question if you took a collection of particles that were all shaped in a way that to be like, chair shape, and then you got rid of a cluster of those particles, namely the leg shaped cluster, and you replaced it with a new leg shaped cluster. Well, question: do you have the same chair shaped cluster of particles that you started with? Obviously not, right? Obviously not. In that case, you have a whole new set of particles. Whereas in the chair case, though, it seemed like you had the same chair. Well, just swapping out the leg doesn't change the chair that you're in, but swapping out some particles changes the cluster of particles completely. So it's an interesting question, right? Like, how is it that you can have the same chair by swapping out a leg, but you can't have the same cluster of particles? And if in the end all a chair is a cluster of particles, then shouldn't this sort of, shouldn't it go the same way for both things? Shouldn't it be that you would still have the same cluster even though you got a new cluster, a bit going in for the leg? It seems problematic. It seems like in this case like a chair really can't just be a cluster of particles. It's got to be more than that in some way. Now, there are responses that you can have, and there's lots of different views that I think that are physicalistically in some way or another acceptable. But they're all different, and so insofar as if physicalism or naturalism really are true, then one of these views is probably uh, going to be along the lines of an actually correct view. So you could be what's called a nihilist about objects, and you could say, look, no, let's just go full bore and talk about and take the sciences seriously, and look, the fundamental things that exist are just the fundamental particles, and nothing else really exists apart from those things. There's clusters of particles, and then there's ways that we've come up to there's ways that we come to talk, right? It was really useful for us, throughout our human history to talk about things like tables and chairs and automobiles and kitty cats. But nowadays, we just know that none of those things really exist. It's still useful for us to talk about them, but they don't really exist. The things that exist are the physical particles, and none of those real things actually exist for us. Now, this view is pretty radical. It changes our everyday life and conception and metaphysics. And it means that there, in the end, just aren't any mountains, planets, peoples, cats, chairs, sandwiches, etc. Not even hot dogs, right? I mean, so this is a strong view, but some people that are serious about science think that this is what, in the end, we're going to have to go with. Another view that I think is a little bit more plausible is what we might call non-reductive physicalism. Non-reductive physicalism, instead of reducing all of the different kinds of entities down to just the fundamental stuff, they say, look, yeah, there's the fundamental stuff, but then there are different kinds of things that have different kinds of causal structures at different levels and different levels of explanation. So, there's the physical level, there's the chemical level, there's the biological level, there's the psychological level, there's the macro planet level, stuff like that. And each of these different levels has a different kind of explanation. Different kinds of objects interact differently with different other kinds of things. So smaller things have a level of explanation in which we can talk about how causation works with respect to physical particles. But there's relations between the physical particles and the chemical stuff. But when it comes to talking about physical particles, like fundamental particles, when we talk about quarks and electrons and atoms, that's one level of explanation. Talking about chemicals at a different, or molecules, that's a different level of explanation. Different molecules have different causal powers, and so they do different things to other different chemical particles. And similarly, at a higher level than that, right? Like when we're talking about individual organisms interacting with their environments, we're not just talking about chemical systems interacting with other chemical systems. We're talking about the organisms because they're in some way a unified whole that exists at an explanatory level. And so maybe non-reductive physicalism is the idea that, well, we can't really reduce these explanations. We can't reduce away these objects that are at these different levels, but we can try to give explanations that connect the levels to one another, right? So we can give explanations that connect the biological level to the chemical level and the chemical level to the physical level, but we don't have to reduce them, right? It's not the case that somehow we're reducing them and then getting rid of the existence of these things. Another view that's kind of in the same vicinity is what we might think of as permissivism. And permissivism says, yeah, like non-reductive physicalism is right. And in fact, there's even more than that, right? There's way more stuff that's out there in the world. All of the stuff exists. It's just we don't really know how to explain it. We got to figure out how to explain how the stuff exists. And this kind of permissivism really goes wild and out there sometimes, right? So you probably don't think that like witches exist. But on the permissivist view, they say, well, yeah, witches do exist. They're just not like magical beings. What witches are is some kind of like mythical character. They're like fictional or something like that. So the permissivist goes even further and they say, yeah, guess what? Human beings exist, particles exist, cats and dogs, chemical kinds, but so do things like, Sherlock Holmes and Harry Potter. And then you say, wait a minute, what? Sherlock Holmes is clearly not a real person. Neither is Harry Potter. There are no boy wizards in the world. And they say, yeah, you're totally right. And guess what? Harry Potter doesn't exist as a real life boy wizard because there aren't any of those. But what there actually is in the world is fiction. And fiction is a real kind of thing. We invent fictional characters. And so fictional characters are real. They're just real as fictional characters, right? That's what Harry Potter is. He's a fictional boy wizard. He doesn't exist as a real boy wizard. It's like, it's like making a toy duck. When you like make a plushy stuffed animal toy duck, you haven't made a real duck, but you have made a real plushy toy duck, right? It's still a real thing. It's just not the kind of, thing that you might have thought they were suggesting at first. And beyond permissivism, and permissivism gets pretty out there because it's like, what the heck? I don't really know what a fictional character is, but okay, I guess that maybe those things exist because we talk about them a lot. You get this even further view, which gets us back closer to a form of dualism, and that's the Platonist or the dualist sort of view, which denies physicalism itself, right? In the end, the Platonist or dualist view says, no, in the end, there are all these kinds of objects, these kinds of things that exist that aren't physical. There's something more than physical. So there's the physical stuff that the world is made out of, and then there's the stuff that's more than physical, the other kinds of things that exist, the forms or the minds of things, or consciousness itself. So that sort of concludes the general structure of this broad ranging lecture that I'm giving. It's just kind of just an introduction to ways of thinking about some of these issues. But now I want to present two classic puzzles that I think are really fun, and stuff like this will come up throughout the rest of this section in the class. How many things are there, right? Imagine you're pointing at like your nearest chair or your nearest table, or even, some object, a book on your table or your computer. Point at it and think, how many things are right there? You look at it and you say like, okay, like look at your computer. You've got one computer, right? But how many things are actually there? I mean, there's the computer, but there's also like the screen and the keyboard, and there's the corner, the top right corner of your computer and the top left corner of your computer. There's some, buttons. There's a lot of buttons actually, and there's a power button, and there's probably a mouse or a mouse pad. You might have a charger. Like, how many things really are there? Like, now we're starting to count. There's a lot of things that are there. In a sense, there's one thing, but then there's also a lot of things. So it's an interesting question. How many things really are there? Um, Here's a rule that we need to know about. So first of all, it's Leibniz's law. When we're talking about counting things, um, if X and Y, take two objects, or just, really it's not even two objects in this case, it's one object, but we're naming it X and Y. We're using variables. Like you can imagine in math with a variable X and Y, you can put the same number in for both X and for Y, right? Same thing here. If X and Y are identical, that is, if they are the same thing, then every property that X has is a property that Y has as well. That's Leibniz's law. That's just to say, look, if you've got something, then whatever that thing is, it's got all the same properties that it has. Now, this principle is about what's called numerical identity. Things that are numerically identical, one and the same thing, have all the same properties. They're the same color, they're in the same location, they are related to all the same things, they exist in the same way, blah, blah, blah. Now, we've got to distinguish between numerical and qualitative identity. Qualitative identity is what happens when you've got two of the same thing, and those two things have all the same qualities, right? They look the same, they feel the same, they sound the same, they smell the same, right? Here's an idea of it. Like, two people can wear the same shirt. It's not the same shirt, it's just the same kind of shirt. It's qualitatively identical. That's not what we're worried about with Leibniz's law. Leibniz's law is worried about numerical identity. And if I say that we're talking about the same shirt, two people wearing the same shirt, I'm talking about this kind of shirt where there's two people wearing one shirt, right? That shirt, those are two people wearing the same shirt. And here, so if we imagine this shirt being X and Y, if X and Y are identical, then every property X has is a property that Y has as well, right? This thing, if this thing is identical with this thing, then every property that this thing has is a property that this thing has. That should be super obvious and clear. All right, now let's take the puzzle of the statue in the clay. Take a lump of clay, right? Imagine you've got a lump of clay and you make it into a statue. Great. So now you got a piece of clay, you made it into a statue, and then you smush that statue. All right, so time one, you got a lump of clay. Time two, you make it into a statue. Time three, you smush the statue into a lump of clay again. Now, think about these assumptions, right? Before you form the clay into the statue at time t1, the lump of clay is not a statue. It's just a lump of clay. Next assumption, when you smush the statue, at time t3, the statue ceases to be a statue, right? It stops really existing as a statue. Assumption number 3, the lump of clay never stops being a lump of clay, right? Even when you've shaped it into a statue, you still got a lump of clay there, right? It's now more than a lump of clay in a sense. It's also a statue, but it's still just that same lump of clay, because lumps of clay don't have to be shaped in any way particularly at all. Now, according to Leibniz's law, because of these three little assumptions, the statue is not the same thing as the lump of clay. Now, why is that? Well, the lump of clay was around before the statue was around, so that's a property that the lump of clay has that the statue doesn't. Similarly, the lump of clay can exist after the statue is smashed. That again is a property that the lump of clay has that the statue doesn't. We've got the same matter here in different forms. So now the question is, well, when there's a statue, at time t2, how many things are there? How many things are located where the statue is? It's an interesting question. One way of thinking about it is that it's two, right? It's got to be at least two. Um, if it's got to be at least two because the statue and the clay aren't identical, and remember, the statue is, co-located in exactly the same place as the lump of clay when it's been made. But the statue can only exist for a certain amount of time, right? The lump of clay existed before it. The lump of clay continues to exist after you smush it. But at the time at which the statue is constructed, we've got two things in the same spot. We've got the lump of clay and we've got the statue, and they're totally different things. If you think about it, if this example, if you don't like statues because statues have to be made, you can imagine, think about the examples like a mountain or a planet. It seems like all of the matter of a planet at some point was spread out across the universe. And then at some point, all of that matter came to form a planet. And now we've got, a clump of matter and a planet that are co-located in the same spot. And then if you blow that planet up, the matter doesn't cease to exist. It gets spread out all across the universe again. But the planet, does cease to exist. So there's no longer a planet there, but the lump of matter is still there. It's just spread out. So that, in a sense, when you think about like how many things are there when you're looking at a planet, well, at the very least, there's got to be two things. There's the planet itself that came to exist at a certain time and will go out of existence at a certain time, and then there's the clump of matter, and the clump of matter, existed long before the planet existed and will exist long after the planet ceases to exist. It just is going to be spread out. Another example, and this one's pretty fun, and we'll come back to this example, is the ship of Theseus. It's a good puzzle. Now, imagine you take a ship that's made of 100 planks, and one of the planks, on this new ship, you take it out to sea, and you're going for a little while. One of the planks starts to rot, and so you replace it. You put the slightly damaged, slightly rotting plank into your barn, and don't you forget about it. Slowly over time, you replace every single plank on the ship, and every time you replace a plank, you put the damaged plank into your barn. Now, eventually, you've got so much wood in your barn that you're like, hey, let me build a ship out of this. Oh, you know what? I think I've got the plans for the ship that I've got out in the harbor. Let me just put all of the planks that I've got here in the barn back together in the same way that that original ship was put together. Now, question: which ship is the ship of Theseus? Right. So we've got A here, the original ship, and over time we're sort of removing the planks from the ship. And at the end of the time, at time T2, we've got ship B over here, right? But at the same time, at time T2, we've taken all of the planks and constructed ship C. Now, clearly, ship A and ship B aren't exactly the same ship. But question: is A, the original ship of Theseus, ship B? Or is A ship C? Or is A neither ship A? Is it neither B nor C? I'm not really entirely sure what to think. It seems like ship A over time slowly became ship B. Ship A and ship B are the same ship. But it also looks like ship A and ship C have a good claim to being the same ship, right? Because ship A is composed of all these parts. And then, it seems like A is in some way disassembled slowly over time. And then ship C is A being reassembled in some way. But ship B and ship C clearly aren't the same ship. So if ship B and ship C, because they're in different places at different times. One's in my garage, my barn, and one's like out to sea. So, but it can't be that A is identical with C and that A is identical with B, because if that's true, then A, B, and C are all exactly the same ship. And that's crazy. So how are we supposed to answer this, right? Well, it's a problem of identity over time. And you can think about it with respect to ships, you can think about it with respect to persons, you can think about it with respect to anything. Now, according to Leibniz's law, um, x is identical with y only if x and y have all and only the same properties. Now, A and B, they don't actually share any planks, right? So you might think, well, A can't be B then, right? Oops. But it also seems like A didn't become a new ship just because one plank was swapped out, right? So like from time to time, we're only swapping out one plank at a time. So it doesn't seem like like the chair leg swapping scenario. It's like from time t1 to time t2, you didn't somehow just swapping out one plank doesn't make you get you a whole new ship. And so then from time t2 to time t3, swapping out one more plank doesn't seem like it's going to get you a whole new ship either. So it seems like you've got this like arbitrary number of swaps that somehow gets you from A to B. And if you think that A somehow ceases to exist there, it's an interesting question. Like, well, when did it stop existing? Was it somehow at like the point at which you swapped out half of the planks? Like, is it not until you swap out the very last plank? Like, what's the reason then for thinking that you've got a totally different ship? And when we talked about personal identity, we'll see why this isn't really a good way of thinking. Oops. Similarly, A and C are, while they're made of the same planks, B and C, B isn't C, right? So if B is A, then C can't be A. So what gives, right? It seems like at the very least, something has got to be identical with A, something has got to be the original ship, but it's not entirely clear what could possibly be the original ship. All right, that's the end of this thinking a little bit, presenting a little bit on these puzzles. Watch some of the YouTube videos that I've posted below. They're a little bit more explanatory, I think, and you can start to think about these puzzles, and maybe we can discuss them more as this section on metaphysics continues.